um, sort of a mix between design and engineering here at Thinkful. The page you're on, sessions at thinkful.com, as well as a whole lot of other pages, were designed by me. So like all the layout and all the icons and stuff, even though I didn't really draw most of the icons. My background is in publishing. So when I was in high school and college, I did a bunch of like yearbook, and then a technical publication, and some zines, and I was taking a CS degree, so it just kind of fell on me that there's this whole front end development thing. So I've been doing CSS for about 10 years, which is kind of sad. It's definitely it's an understated language. I think a lot of people are underestimated. You might think that you know it, and then 10 years later, you still find new things about it. So I'm just going to start with what is design, because you guys are in development, and it's arguable which one is kind of the bigger circle in the Venn diagram. Because on one hand, engineering is how things work, and it's getting from an idea of this is what I want to do, to actually being able to get the right lever and accomplish that with technology. And then design is the kind of the other side of that hand, is what should you do, right? So it's like, what abilities do you give to users? What functions need to be done? So there's a lot of like fundamental questions about any product you make before you even get to the engineering point. So it's kind of like asking the why question. Okay, that's maybe a little heady of a start. I'm just gonna start screen sharing. I've got a little presentation going. Full screen it. All right. Well, it has the Firefox header on it. It's got to be a full screen presentation. I guess I can do it in preview.
I think full screen in Firefox is an F11, just like Chrome, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not helpful. All right, it's a little, there's some Chrome on it. I'm sorry about that.
It's all right.
So this is just something I made today. So don't expect anything too over the top. All right. Okay. So design at its core is not just what something looks like; it's how it works, right? So when you think about a well-designed water bottle, it's got it's nobody thinks about like, oh, is it you don't really care just about the looks of it. You care, is it easy to refill? Can I actually twist and open it? I'm sure there's some brands of water bottle that are like really hard to open, especially for like sickly people or children or anything like that. So that's one consideration you might have around the design of a water bottle. Yeah, there's definitely a misconception going around that design is like, oh, it's how it looks. I'm not a designer, and I can make this crazy app, right? With like login states and something like GitHub, you wouldn't be able to make it work right without doing design. So even if you consider yourself to not be a designer when you're making an app, you are definitely doing design. So I would say that the front end is where it's arguably even more design than engineering. It's definitely in both Venn diagrams. So if there's it's both engineering and design, right? Okay. So what we're going to cover today are just some design concepts. So the stuff that you may have gotten into through the Norman Door video. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the tools you have within CSS to create layouts. And then we're going to cheat our way to a nice typographic scale and show you how you might create an article layout. So in the Norman Door video, I don't know if you've seen it. It was just a little description of Don Norman, and it talked about doors. And they have this door where there's a vertical bar on either side, and no sign saying whether you pull or push it. And because it's a handle, the affordance there is to pull on it. So what Don Norman basically said in his 1988 book, The Design of Everyday Things, is that, basically you should have to only display the right affordances that apply to, let's say a door. So if it's a push door, you should have some object that's natural to push onto, such as the fire door, bar, or like a metal plate or some other design that you can't grip and pull. So this is a fundamental concept in design. It's like, what can you see, and what is the intuitive way to use something? And on the other side, you've got feedback. So when you actually do something, such as try to pull on a door, there's feedback. It's like if it doesn't open, that's feedback telling you, oh, you're wrong, and you should use it the other way. You should push the door. So whenever you're using something, whether it's a light switch or something else, those are the two directions where information flows. It's like, I want to turn on the lights. So you look for affordances like a light switch, and then you try to act on it. If the lights go on, that's it. You've done the action that you wanted to do. But there might be an issue. Maybe you're turning on some kind of fan or some other light switch that doesn't do anything, and you have to continue flipping the light switches, etc. On the web, there's a whole lot of feedback, and there's also a whole lot of problems with feedback. So whenever servers go down, whenever there are unforeseen kinds of like characters in your forms, or some kind of disability that the user has, it becomes increasingly complex to reply to the user's actions with the right feedback. So definitely the affordances side, like what buttons you present, etc., are more obvious as a design principle, right? It's like, what buttons do you put on the page, and what can the user click on, is something that people talk about all the time in design. And then feedback sometimes goes under the rug, and you don't end up coding for those states when the server goes down or there's some kind of error in Stripe and the page just kind of explodes, or it's left with a spinning wheel. So it's important to consider both directions of sort of information flow. There's information from the user to your app, and then something happens in your app, and then the information has to come back to the user. So if there's something that you saved, you should let the user know that the item's been saved, etc. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So those are the two fundamental things in design. And we can talk about what specifically is web design. It usually gets split into two big fields. There's definitely a lot of other subfields within these and crisscrossing elements. So there's the user experience. It's like what you can see, what's the most important thing on the page, and then what happens outside of the application. So things like, oh, I received an email promotion, things like that happen asynchronously, like not within your app, are part of the user experience. And then user interface is more the nuts and bolts of visual elements, typography, etc. All right, so what are the kind of terms that web designers use? A word that gets thrown around a lot is hierarchy. So if you're designing, hey, what's up, Varun?
Hey, how's it going, everybody?
What's going on?
Yeah, good.
So one of the terms that gets thrown around a lot is hierarchy. So what goes above the fold? The fold is a term from newspapers. So it's a term from newspapers. When you read a newspaper, you would you wouldn't unfold it until maybe like half an hour into reading it. If there was some interesting story or something like that. And if you pass by a newspaper stand, you wouldn't see anything below the fold, right? So the fold is a similar analogy in web design. It just means what is on the screen without you scrolling or somehow getting to a different, acting on the content to get somewhere else. So what are the visible elements on the GitHub dashboard, and then what is 1 click away or 2 clicks away? That's a very important piece of web design that drives users to do what you want them to do. If it's successful, it always gives the user exactly what they want to see without too many clicks, etc. And there's a point to this, which is if your hierarchy is broken in like a black and white screen with all like Helvetica, like the most default fonts, it's going to be broken no matter what you do to the aesthetics of the page. So it's important to kind of split away the aesthetics from hierarchy and like the importance of various elements of the page. It's not entirely separable, but there's definitely different concerns to hierarchy than, say, color or text.
Okay.
All right, next up. All right, and now we get into contrast and aesthetics. You can take a bunch of art courses in college, and half of them will boil down to contrast. So if something is all black, it can't, you don't see any. Can you share these later? Oh, yeah. Let's see. Yep. So now we're on the contrast aesthetic slide 8. Okay. So contrast is definitely where you get into like the artistry of design. Is something, what do you spot in this arrangement? You're probably going to see the giant headline. They're depending on how white or black the background is, different elements would show up more prominently. Like the orange and the blue are the only like striking colors here, so that those are the elements that catch the eye early on. There's definitely like a whole world to this, right? There's colors, topography, etc. And I guess I separated out topography here because especially given the kind of content that is on the web, I think it's important to think of topography kind of separate from this. But it's all in one package. The aesthetics of how specific things look on the page can definitely take a website from like a 6 to a 10. They definitely can't take a like a bad hierarchy to a 10, but the way you get to like a really, really beautiful site is obviously with beautiful elements, beautiful details. And part of this is also the spacing, right? So contrast is not only a color contrast, so black and white, but also kind of the context of where an element lands. So if it's a logo that is surrounded by other elements that don't really fit it, like if you don't give an icon enough space, you can damage the aesthetics of the site. So spacing, like both white space and the positive and negative space, you have to consider both of them rather than just think of, oh, like the actual buttons matter. It's the buttons and the amount of margin around it that matters. So that balance is what really makes a site super, super pretty. So whenever you're evaluating a site and you're like, wow, this looks great, or I feel great acting on whatever elements are in a site, or I love reading on this website because of this and that, really pay attention to the white space as well as the actual elements. Okay. So typography, basically the same concerns as contrast and aesthetics, but it all has to do with words. Typography has been around since 1400s, since the printing press, which the printing press was probably in the 1500s. I don't really know my history. So the baseline for a decent website is, can you read it without strain? Is there a consistent relationship between the size of the fonts, etc.? So if if you use a bunch of different sizes and don't really reuse the same font size or font style, the site would look sloppy. Whereas if you kind of constrain yourself and just use a few very good sizes that match, each other in some way, which we'll talk about when we get to actually doing the article template. So basically, just consistency is a lot of what makes typography good. Just as in the contrast, don't think of typography as simply like what is the typeface, what is the size of the type, right? We can, actually I should probably modify this slide to show like the effect of line height, for instance. So the spacing between the lines is one of the most important measurements in typography, and it's just as important as what font you choose. So also think about the negative space and the space between elements when you consider typography. Cool.
Yep.
All right. So any questions on these? I think that's it for the design concepts part.
Nope, no
No,
questions.
that's all good.
No.
Oh, wow. So yeah, just to recap real quick, affordances, what can you see on the page? What can you act on? Feedback, what does the application let you know? So basically, do you know what actually happened? Or are you just hoping that something happened? When you place an order, some pages just take you back to anything but like a confirmation page, and you're like, what's going on? Web design, lots of different pieces to it. Content, just like the writing is also a big piece that falls probably somewhere within user experience, but it's unique as well. Animations definitely falls under user interface and is unique to web design as opposed to like print or something. Same with responsive. Hierarchy, so like what's the most important thing on the page? Very important. And it should work without any like aesthetic layers, right? You should try to think of your, that's why there's tools like Balsamic that let you build a whole web page out of these pre-built, like crappy looking drawing kinds of elements. Just because it lets you not think about the aesthetic side of it and really think about the user's actions, what's the most important and prominent thing on the page, and not start an argument with your designer or your CEO about what font or what color we're using. After that comes a sort of layer that enhances the design, which is aesthetics. It's hard to say what, it's hard to give this one a name. But yeah, it's like the actual artistry. Typography is another form of that artistic aesthetic side of design. And in web design, just as in print, it's really important because you're actually, think about it, you've never read a word that hasn't been filtered through the sift of typography, right? So every word you read is somehow sprinkled with a particular font. So if you read something in Helvetica, it's normal and boring. And then if you read something in some other font, it has its own characteristics.
Okay, so I guess like for typography, like, the font styles that you choose should always, I guess, highlight. Like if you're reading text, right? If you're reading like a long paragraph, you kind of want to go with like a sans serif font so that it's easier for the person to read. And then I guess for a headline, you want to have a sans font, which is basically it stands out more because it's its own item.
I mean, yeah. So I'll have a set of pro tips for picking fonts.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would say that prioritize ease of reading over anything else. For headlines, it's not as important, so you can use more interesting fonts in the headline size.
Mhm.
And then for text, yeah, there's definitely good serif and good sans serif fonts for body text. In books, for instance, it's always serif, right? There's very few. Maybe just pull up. Yeah. So you've got serif fonts. Serif fonts are the ones with little curlies on the end. So here the words can, I, read, etc.
Yeah.
That's a serif font. The headline typography is sans serif. It doesn't have
Gotcha.
those curlies. Okay, so let's talk about how we actually make a design in CSS. And you guys already went through Unit 1 of Feud, which covers kind of desperately as little as possible to get you going without making you terrified of CSS. So I'm going to dive a little bit further into the rabbit hole here. So to make a modern website, you really only need to know that first paragraph. How does display block work? How does display inline work? How does display inline block work? Which is just confusing that it's the other two names put together. And then a little bit of positioning. So a few elements you'll need to use position absolute or relative to handle. You guys have already covered floats and normalize and reset, I believe. Who can tell me what normalize.css does?
I don't know.
All right.
It removes all browser-specific styles. So each browser applies its own user style sheet, and normalize just sets everything to like a base plate, if you will.
Yeah, it's a good answer. Normalize is a really good piece of code, especially like maybe once you get into building your own style guide. That's when you should consider not using normalize and in effect building your own normal. So let's look at normalize.css. My personal machine. All right. Oh, you should definitely go through this file on your own. Because it's got really good comments. So it doesn't have too many comments, but enough that enough to give you a foothold, and then you can look up the specific attributes. So here, body, margin 0. This is basically a hint that some browsers actually have a margin on the body. And they do this because if you just see an empty HTML page with no CSS, back in like the old days, you want it to look like a document, So putting text all the way to the edge of the page would feel clunky, right? So if the CSS doesn't load, there's a margin on the bottom. Here, it basically sets all the HTML5 elements to display block or display inline block, depending on what kind of element they are. All images and video and like media. Let me just boost this, see if I can get everybody to see this. Is that visible?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So when you read through normalize, you'll be like, a canvas tag is display inline block by default. I wonder what else is. So you'll discover that images are also display inline block. Says audio, apparently some iOS versions have height set on audio tags. Like that stuff you don't really need to, it doesn't really give you any new information, but you can tell where browsers are different in their render.
Okay.
So for instance, there's a gray background on active links in IE10. Normalize removes that, etc. Font weights. Okay, so here we get to the part of normalize that really isn't a reset, right? Normalize combines a CSS reset, which clears all the differences between browsers, with a set of sort of sane defaults. And an H1, for instance, is font size 2em, which is double the current context. So whatever the font size is in the element where you're placing an H1, double that, and that's the size of the H1. And then the margin is like 2/3 of an EM. Similarly, this is a subscript and superscript element. It gives them a default sizing for that. Add some figure styling, gives it an HR. All right, you get the idea. So it's a little bit of font sizes, and it's 400 lines. We just went through most of it. And I encourage you to read it on your own as well. All right, let's go into one of the code pens. So I know you guys should have learned something about display block and inline block. I just want to cover a few of these edge cases that aren't easy to grasp. And basically some of the trickier parts of the distinctions, right?
Border box, yeah.
Yeah, so border box is one of them. This doesn't come with a normalize or a reset, but it's been really common since 2012. It'll either say star box sizing border box, or it will say star box sizing inherit, and then you put on body with the border box. So that's like two different ways of doing it. Either you inherit everything up from the body, or you just say star border box everything. Yeah, box sizing border box. Okay. So here I'm just showing a couple of the things you can do with elements. You guys should know all of these. These are two example boxes on top of each other. The top one has spans for every word, and then the bottom one doesn't. So let's remove these things. Okay. First thing you'll notice is that spans lay out just like text does, all on its own. This is because text gets transformed into basically text elements, so into inline elements. You don't see them here, but when it goes to actually lay it out, it creates a inline element, places it, makes a space between the inline element, places it, and so on. And the rules are very much the same if you have spans. So spans are an example of display inline, which is the most simple display rule. That by default they're display inline. You can definitely set, regardless of what element, what the element's default display attribute is, you can change it. So if we made all the spans display block, then they would be laid out below each other. And this one, again, is without the spans. It's just the default, just the text. So yeah, you can change the display property everywhere. I suppose you guys know. Okay, so what's interesting about display inline versus display inline block, right? So if we make the spans display inline block, it looks like nothing changes. Great. So if you don't have anything else set on the display inline block elements, like if you don't add paddings or borders, they act just the same as text. They they get laid out until they reach the end of a line, and then they go to the next line. One interesting thing here is that the space here is rendered as a real space. So that's an element that that will come in. That's something to notice. Basically, display inline block elements, when they're next to each other, they're treated like text. So space in the HTML really adds a space between the elements. So if we had,
I see.
If we had no space here, we had no space in the HTML, there would be no space in the layout. Cool. All right, so it's treated like text. Now let's try to make a border bottom of 30 pixels on these spans. See what happened there? Let's do something so we can see. Okay, so basically I just took the there is an element that has a border bottom, and then is an element that has a border bottom. Below it, text is an element that has a border bottom. So borders, if you're in display inline, the regular span without our display inline block. Borders don't change the size of the element. Similarly, paddings don't change the size of the element. Paddings, I think, on the sides might. 20 pixels, but you can't like see it. Yeah, it definitely changes the size of it. But for vertical spacing, only line height changes display inline elements. So if I have a line height of 80, those elements are above each other, by a different size. Okay. So yeah, it says that the size of the element is small. It shows that, even though the next one comes way below. So if you encounter elements that seem to not be spaced correctly vertically, there's a difference in, the browser's telling you, oh, this element is this size, but the next one goes way further down. Look out for display inline and line height. Basically, that's what determines how display inline elements are arranged on the page, not borders, not margins, to some extent. Everybody cool with that?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's the difference between display inline. Oh, and I guess I'll have to show what happens in this case with inline block. So with inline block, the elements just got taller. I'm actually seeing like the correct size. So the next line is actually, the next line's element starts right below the previous line's element. So it's more predictable when it's inline block. The line height and the borders are added to get the height, right? Because the line height is where the text is. So if you had more than one line of text, it would be that many line heights. It would be the inner height of the element. So if we look at the box model, let me change my theme. Sorry. All right. Yeah. So this inner box of the of an inline block element or a block element is generally the number of lines of text times the line height, and then you've got the border on the outside, paddings on the outside. Inline block and block are basically the same, except block takes up the full width, and they stack. Inline block takes up the minimum amount of width, so like whatever the content of it is, and they go side by side. The big difference, minus the side by side aspect, is that spaces show up in HTML. The spaces in HTML show up between inline block elements. All right. Okay, I think that's enough like review. For block, I think you guys all remember this stuff. These are two displayed block elements. The margin auto works. So if you have margin auto on the sides, and it will sort of snap to the center or some other direction. So you can have margin left auto and margin right 0. That would snap the element to the right side. So if we had 0 auto, so we can do that kind of thing with display block. But you can't put both of these side by side using if they're display block. These two boxes, if you want to make them go side by side, you would have to change them to be display inline block. And then inline block, the default vertical alignment is the other thing that determines this arrangement. Does anybody know what it is? Or like why this box is at this kind of arrangement and the next one is lower but not at the bottom?
Okay.
Anybody? You see that?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So the reason for this is the vertical align attribute, which is important in line block. So there's options like top. The top of the elements is arranged, and there's bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And the default is a third one called baseline. And baseline is the bottom of the text. So you can see that the bottom of the text here and here, that's called the baseline. And that's by default what gets leveled out. So the browser lays out the first box, and then the second box goes such that the last word of any text inside that box gets aligned to the bottom of the first box.
I got you.
And even though the actual text is further down with some children within the inline block element, it still does all that computation. This seems basically, if you're trying to make a grid and you're trying to arrange boxes next to each other, you have to change this to vertical align top. If you're trying to put buttons next to each other, I'd actually keep it at vertical align baseline. It's often what you want. So there are cases for both. The most common use case for display inline block is like something like a button, right? So it's something that will have maybe two of them in a row, and then there'll be a little cancel link or something like that next to that. And in those cases, you generally just want the text to align. Okay, that's enough CSS review. We have about half an hour, and the next half hour, we're gonna do a little project.
Okay,
And
cool.
it involves pancakes. I hope you guys like pancakes.
I love waffles.
Waffles. You can actually, you can probably go ahead and make it about waffles. So I'm gonna make a new pen from this template that I have. Oh, template changed. No. Spoilers. All right. Okay. All right. Save. Okay, this should be good. All right. So if you want to just start with this and fork this, basically we have a bunch of text about pancakes, and it's all, not perfect HTML5 or anything like that, but just to my liking and not too complex. So we can, what we're gonna do basically is talk about what makes an article layout work, how to put it together in CSS, and how can we sort of cheat our way to nice typography, even though we don't have a design background or anything like that. And I have a whole, this is a different workshop that I gave a few months ago. And what we just covered was the box model. Basically, I just don't want to come back to that when I'm explaining like how the alignments work and stuff like that. And I'm more or less going to follow this script. I don't really remember it too well. But then we have a couple, we'll actually go through a couple of the more advanced things that I tend not to cover in the default workshop. So that's the gist. If you want to follow it, I'll definitely send you guys all the links afterwards. There was Bamik gave me a link yesterday that actually had a really nice cheat sheet for typography. I guess he might have posted it. Okay, so did everybody fork the code pen?
I'm doing that right now.
Yeah. So